Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. Welcome to our webinar on navigating the Canadian ELD Mandate. I'm Dwayne Primo. I'm really excited to have you join us. We have some special guests today and a pretty jam-packed schedule. And as everyone knows, we're in the midst of the implementation of ELD technology, one of the biggest changes in the trucking industry here in Canada in some time from a technology perspective. We've heard a lot of questions from clients and thought it would be a good time to get some experts together to help answer those questions. So we're going to jump right into things, given we have a pretty full agenda and quite a few participants today. Again, thank you for joining. The agenda we're going to cover today is kicking things off with introductions of our panelists and moderator. We're going to provide an update on who Northern Business Intelligence is, the private motor trucking council. Geotab will provide, Mike will take us through updates on the Canadian ELD and the latest on the ELD deployment and mandate. We'll then take, Julie will moderate questions of our panelists, and we will open up the floor to questions and look to answer all the questions that we can through the Q&A. And please use the Q&A in the Zoom session to post your questions. We may address some written, and time allowing, we'll verbally address any questions we can. Few housekeeping items. Additionally, watch out for polls. We will have a few polls to gather your feedback and make this webinar interactive today. All of you who are attending will be entered into a draw for one of a few Yeti water bottles, which are pretty nice. Keep us all hydrated in the heat of now September. There will be a survey following the webinar. We really appreciate your feedback, so please fill that in. And if there are any questions following the webinar, you can reach our team at northernbi.com or any of the contacts with NBI. So with that, we're going to jump right into the first point of business, which are introductions. Really excited to have Mike Millian join us, and thank you, Mike, for joining. Mike is the president of the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada and is a very knowledgeable individual in all things related to this mandate and how it's impacting carriers. We also have Brent McInnis, the senior product manager with Geotab, who knows the technology quite well, having led the development of Geotab's ELD technology. I've introduced myself. I'm the president of Northern Business Intelligence, and we also have Julie Darnborough, who is our marketing manager, and will be moderating questions for our panelists. So that's the group you see on the cameras today, and we'll jump right into a bit of an overview of the organizations about Northern Business Intelligence. So we are focused on helping clients across Canada and the US implement telematics technology and ELD technology. We're really focused on helping provide industry-leading technology. Geotab is the technology we've chosen and have worked with since 2005. And our focus is on helping our clients implement this to address their compliance goals, their safety goals, and improve efficiency in their fleet. So that's a little bit about us. Certainly, if there's any questions on ELD technology needs from anyone on the phone, we are there to help. And Mike, if you could take a moment to introduce the PMTC.
Sure. Thanks, Dwayne. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be invited to be part of this webinar. The PMTC stands for the Private Motor Truck Council of Canada. We're the only national association that represents the views and interests of Canada's private and dedicated fleet operators. We've been around since 1977. About 90% of our membership is private and dedicated fleets. We do have about 10% of for hire fleets that have joined as well. I think understanding that whether you're a private fleet or a for hire fleet, a lot of the issues we deal with, ELDs being one of them, are kind of the same. Goals of our association is to represent our members' views and interests with governments, make sure their voices are heard, provide them with networking opportunities, education, training, regulatory info through our various channels, and as I say, to act as a as a consulting firm, our members can reach out to us whenever they wish with any questions that they may have about rules and regs. And if we don't have the answers, we can connect them with those who will. And I'll leave it at that so we can get into the main topics we want to get into today. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Mike. Brent, would you please give us an introduction and a bit of an update on Geotab?
Absolutely. Again, thanks everyone for letting me or joining and letting me speak to you today about Geotab. Have a lot of information to share, but about Geotab, if you're not familiar, we are a telematics company. We do have ELD offerings as well, which is really the main topic for today. We have many certifications, but we are certified in both Canada and the US with our different sets of device. We have over 3.6 million connected devices. So these are vehicles with our telematics units driving around on a regular basis, more than 47,000 individual customers or individual fleets. And we are actually based in Canada, so designed and manufactured. Our headquarters is just outside of Toronto, Ontario, in a town called Oakville, if anyone's familiar. So we're very much ingrained in, Canadian trucking, and we're very excited to speak with you all today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brent. All right, Julie.
All right, we'll start with our first poll. And the first one that we're going to start with today is, do your company vehicles travel outside their home terminal's province? So I'll just launch this one to start. Lots of answers coming in.
Fast and furious.
Very much so. Wow. Just give it a couple more seconds. All right. Okay, thanks all. And it looks like with the participants that are here today, most people's company vehicles do venture outside their home province's terminal. So that's good to know. So you've come to the right place. You likely do need an ELD, but yeah, we'll share some more information. Okay.
Perfect. All right. Fantastic. So we'll move right in then to give Mike the floor to give us a bit of an update on the current status of the Canadian ELD mandate.
Thanks, Dwayne. Giving me the floor can always be a dangerous thing, but I think you can. So the enforcement of the Canadian federal mandate for federally regulated carriers, which the poll indicated at least 61% of the carriers online here are, began January 1st of 2023. And it said it applies to the same federally regulated carriers who are required to maintain daily logs. And just so people understand, under the federal regulations, the National Safety Code, any vehicle over 4,500 kgs is considered a commercial motor vehicle and is required to keep hours of service, which means they need an ELD. It is slightly different in some provinces. Alberta and Saskatchewan, as an example, over 10,000 kgs is considered commercial motor vehicle. But if you're federally regulated and running through those provinces, the 4,500 kg above is what applies to you because you're now a federally regulated carrier. ELD must be third-party certified in Canada. Currently 90, I believe there's 96, it says 97 on here, so unless one was just added. You have to submit to a independent third-party certification body to be certified, which differs from what we have in the US. There was originally 3 certification bodies who were doing this. CSA Group, who was one of the 3 certification bodies, announced publicly in July that they are voluntarily withdrawing from this. That will have a bit of an effect for new people that are entering. Won't be that big a deal. There's still 2 certification bodies you can apply to. Where it will have an effect is every device that is certified has to go through a process every year where some certain amount of their devices retested for certification. So all the ones that were going through the process of being certified, recertified through CSA, they will finish those. And then the rest of their customers, when it comes time to being recertified again, will have to be flipped over to one of the other two certification bodies. Technical standard is in the process of being reviewed again. Transport Canada says they will have a draft to industry this fall sometime. And then industry will have a period where they can comment on the changes that are made in that technical standard before it becomes law, hopefully sometime in 2024. Okay, if we want to flip to the next slide.
Okay, Dwayne, go ahead. All right, so this is the kind of our first question for our panel. We gathered a lot of questions from the registrations of the webinar, and we noticed some trending questions and inquiries. So we're going to review what we put together from that. We couldn't answer every single question that was submitted, of course, but if you guys do have any follow-up questions after the webinar, you can submit those via the survey. All right, so we'll kick off with this first one, which is about the provincial timelines. Mike, can you give us a brief overview of the current ELD mandate provincial timelines?
Yeah, so as we sit here today, every province and territory is enforcing this for provincially regulated carriers, except for Alberta and Saskatchewan, who currently have no plans to enforce this for provincially regulated carriers at all. We're rather disappointed with that. We keep pushing for a change in that, but right now they have no plans to enforce it for provincially regulated carriers. Newfoundland is going to begin on December 1st. Nova Scotia will begin on January 1st. PEI, you see an NA for not applicable there. And what that means is if you are a carrier who never leaves the island, province of Prince Edward Island, by default, you do not have to keep an ELD because the entire island is within 160-kilometer radius. And if you're within 160-kilometer radius, you're not required to keep a logbook, which means you do not need an ELD. So that's where we sit. Everybody will have it by January 1st, except Alberta and Saskatchewan. Keep in mind, though, even if they're not enforcing it for provincially regulated carriers, they are enforcing it for federally regulated carriers. So if you are coming from outside of Alberta or Saskatchewan, or even if you're an Alberta carrier who goes into Saskatchewan, you're now a federally regulated carrier, and it will be enforced for you in those provinces if you are a federally regulated carrier, even in the two that are not enforcing.
All right, great. That's a good point, Mike. Yeah, if you're traveling within those provinces and outside of them, if you're federally regulated, you still will need an ELD.
Yeah.
All right, next question. All right, this one is directed at Mike once again. How are ELD violations being tracked and recorded? So where can we find information about the fines?
Well, and there's a couple different answers to that, unfortunately, which there generally is in Canada. For the most part, provinces and territories will adopt the federal regulations into their provincial regulations, which then means, and a carrier is tracked according to the home province that they're registered in. So there's carrier safety rating or carrier profile. So when you're fined in that province or jurisdiction, the points that are assigned onto your carrier safety rating and profile will then go back to your home jurisdiction. So there's a couple things that are supposed to happen. We have what we call a conviction equivalency table, a CET. And this is a table that all the provinces and territories have agreed to put a minimum point value on, no matter which province or territory you're charged in. So for instance, Ontario may have a higher point value if you get fined for not having a certified ELD than Alberta would. But they agree that if you're a federally regulated carrier getting fined outside of your own jurisdiction, the CET is a table where if you're an Ontario carrier fined in Alberta, there's a minimum point value that will then go back to your carrier safety rating profile in Ontario and assigned and vice versa. So a couple issues right now is there's only one charge mentioned in the CET, and it's operating without a certified ELD. There's no other mentions of any other ELD violations in the CET. So that needs to be updated. It's something that should have been updated a long time ago. They're still working on it. Until that is updated, what ends up happening is the provinces that have adopted regulations, those carriers are going to be dealt with more severely than the provinces that have not adopted point values and regulations for the fines. Because if you're an Alberta carrier who gets charged in Ontario, those points are not going back onto your provincial safety rating in Alberta, right? But if you're an Ontario one who's operating outside, the points will go back. So we have an uneven tracking. There's also contravention regulations that the federal government just brought out recently. Those are fines, 3 different fine values from mild, medium, and harsh. I believe the maximum fine is 1,000, the minimum 300. What that allows it to do is provinces that haven't adopted the regulations, it makes it easier for them to find federally regulated carriers. Because in Alberta and Saskatchewan, if they were to enforce the federal regulations right now, they have to do what they call a long form, which most of them don't want to do. So that the contravention regulations makes it easier for the officers in those provinces to at least find the carriers, but it's still not going to show up in the point value. So there's still some work that needs to be done to make sure this is consistent from province to province, no matter where you operate it.
All right, thank you. And another popular question that we had was, if a driver is pulled over, what can the DOT officer ask for, or what can be audited?
Yeah, so they need a manual. A manual for the device has to be in the vehicle. There has to be a sheet in there which explains to the driver, a lot of us call it a visor card, how to get the information out of the device to the officer, because it is the driver's responsibility, not the officer's. And also an instruction sheet that tells them what to do if there's a malfunction of the device. So those are required for sure. Last 14 days of logs should be in the certified device. However, if you, let's say we're using paper logs for 7 days and then went into an ELD and your logs were not in that ELD, then you're going to have the logs for the portion before you got it in the ELD in your possession. Also keep in mind, there is a place right in the regulation that says you have to have 14 days of blank log sheets in the vehicle. So an officer can ask for that. And the reason those have to be there is because if the device has a malfunction, you are going to have to revert to paper logs. So there has to be blank log sheets in there. I understand there's been some confusion about whether the vehicle inspection needs to be in the device or not. It is not a requirement. You can have it in there if you want, but it's not a requirement. It can still be done on paper. It's not mentioned anywhere in the ELD regulation about the asset inspection. So whether you have it electronically or in paper, you have to make sure that the document itself complies with the regulations for either the federal regs or the province that you're in, but it doesn't matter whether it's electronic or on paper format.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
Yes,
Next
no
slide.
problem.
All right, so this question is directed at Brent. So the Geotab ELD certified device has a variable start time rather than a midnight start time, like most other devices. Why do you feel this is beneficial?
Yeah, this is a common question that comes up since ELDs or ELD providers have the option of certifying an ELD today that has a midnight start time, or the way Geotab has approached it, a variable start time. The difference is where you define a 24-hour period for a driver. So by default, the midnight start time obviously is, midnight to midnight. That's your 24-hour period. But if you want to change that for a variable start time, you could say, 4 a.m. to 4 a.m. That is your 24-hour period. And this changes how your availability or potential violations are calculated. So if if you find yourself wondering which one is actually right for you, I mean, variable kind of covers all situations. So you can't really go wrong with that. But the real benefit to having a variable start time is if you have any drivers in your fleet that may drive overnight, what happens is if you can't change your start of day and you're driving over that midnight threshold, it really complicates the availability calculations and can really mess up some of your driver's days in some cases where the ELD may provide some interesting or colorful information relating to their availability and potentially mark them in violation, potentially improperly or properly, depending on the situation. So if you have any drivers that are going to be driving overnight, it is very beneficial to have an ELD that you're using that can change their start time away from midnight, just to make sure that they're really starting and ending their day within that 24-hour period rather than overlapping. And so a variable start time will give you that flexibility.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Thanks, Brent. Next slide, Dwayne. Thank you. And this is for Brent once again. So Canada has several provincial ELD exemptions. And what has Geotab implemented in terms of these exemptions into the Geotab Drive app itself?
Yeah, this has come up a lot as well recently. If we remember, Mike gave us a great summary. There's a table of which provinces were enforcing provincial ELD. They all are kind of doing it at different times. Some of them aren't doing it at all yet. So it's a bit of a wild card depending on where you are. In some of these provinces, they will have specific regulations separate from the federal availability requirements. So, for example, on the screen here, we have BC logging trucks. So if you're driving a logging truck, you have a different set of criteria that you need to abide by. And because BC has recently, I think it was in August, it started enforcing provincial ELD, this was one of the exemptions that we just determined needed to be put into our product before that time frame. So we are working on a bunch of these, or there's not too many, but the ones that we see come up regularly. So there's one in Alberta, for example, stuff like that will be different than the federally regulated carriers. But we're really targeting right now the provinces that are either about to or have already started enforcing provincial ELDs for their provincial carriers rather than just federally regulated carriers. So that's sort of our mindset on that. But BC logging trucks is a great example on one that we have implemented based on needs of customers and the provincial regulating of those ELD required fleets.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Brent. All right, next question. Okay, so this one's back to Mike. What are some of the concerns and issues you're hearing from PMTC members around the ELD mandate and some of the struggles associated with that?
Yeah, so one of them I touched on already briefly was that CET table. It's key that gets updated so we have equal enforcement from coast to coast, no matter which province or territory you're based out of. Big issue we heard at the start was with the transfer of info from the device to the officer at roadside. That isn't as big of an issue as it was when it began in January, but it is a bit of a concern. And where the issue comes from is there's a PKI system that has to be embedded into the device, which is a secure transfer of data from the device to the officer. On the roadside, it encrypts the logs. And for the officer to then be able to see the logs, they have to be entered in this database system, which gives them an encryption key so they can decrypt the logs and read them. There was a lot of issues at the start where officers either weren't aware of this or weren't aware that they had a decryption key. And then drivers were getting fined, or the carrier was getting fined for not being able to send the data to the officer when in fact the issue wasn't with the driver or the device, it was with the officer themselves not understanding rules. There was a few charges that were put on our members that were forwarded to us that we were able to get removed. So if it has happened, I encourage you to reach out to either your supplier or an association you're part of, because we have been successful in getting these charges removed without even having to go to court if it's proven that they're falsely put through. I haven't heard this happening as much, so I think, as anything that's new comes on, it takes a while to transition. Now that we're 9 months into it, I think it's getting a little bit better with transfer of data. Another issue that I've heard of as well is some confusion from some officers on whether a device is certified. And where that comes from is when a device is certified, there's the name of the manufacturer, the model number of the device, and then a software version or serial number. Well, as these devices have upgrades made to them, which they all do, it may not necessarily match that serial or software number that's listed on the platform. It still is certified, but many officers are thinking it's not and have been falsely either issuing fines or threatening to issue fines. So again, if something like that occurs, I encourage you to reach out to your ELD supplier and get it dealt with. But that's most of the issues the biggest issues we're hearing right now from our members.
Okay, great. Yep. All right, next question, Dwayne. All right, the infamous ferry exemption question. So we've heard about this a lot from our clients, and we just wanted to get some clarity on Mike. So what are you hearing from the CCMTA and or Transport Canada about the ferry exemption?
Yeah, so I guess I'll clarify first. There is a ferry exemption, as you have here on the slide. So the exemption already exists in the regulation. The issue is the EL, it wasn't embedded into the technical standard. So it's not programmed in for the device to be able to handle it correctly. So what happens, for those that aren't aware, with the ferry exemption, you can stop at a location before you get on the ferry. Get on the ferry, and then you get off the ferry, and you can drive up to 30 minutes away and stop again and have that all count towards one continuous rest period. And that's written right into the federal regulation. Now, you still have to show those periods where you moved to go to the ferry from your park location and off the ferry to your park location. You still have to show them as driving time in your logbook. So when you were doing it on paper log, you would record it as a ferry exemption. The officer would see it, calculate it, and wouldn't get charged. What CCMTA is telling us is this is how the officer should be dealing with it on the ELD as well. They still have to interpret it the same as they would have with a paper log. But where the confusion comes in is that device is now going to flag on you that you're in violation. And it's going to flag that you're in violation until you take enough time off to no longer be in violation. So even though you're not in violation, when a driver sees something flashing at them that says they're in violation, it's confusing. It can be confusing to the officer, and it might be hard to convince them they're not in violation when this device is telling them they are. So that's where the confusion comes in. They've said they're going to look at it in the technical standard. I'm not confident it's going to be addressed in the technical standard, to be honest. What we have asked for is enforcement guidance, and we've yet to receive it. Because without enforcement guidance, each individual officer can interpret this differently because we don't have guidance for them as to how to enforce it. So we've asked for Transport Canada CCMTA to provide enforcement guidance that would help the enforcement officers, would help ELD suppliers, and would help drivers and carriers. It's not forthcoming yet. We're hopeful it will. I'm not confident it will, but we're hopeful it will, and we'll keep pushing.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, and you mentioned that there might be something in the updated tech spec this fall, but you're not overly confident that you'll see that.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it's just because if they put it in the technical standard, I think it's, and Brent can speak more to this later, but I think it's still going to be difficult for a lot of ELD suppliers to figure out how to program this to the device. But
Yeah. There are technical problems with how it's laid out today, and even if it becomes in the technical standard, then it'll have to figure out with the, I guess now 2 certification bodies to now test ELDs when they have it implemented and figuring it out that way. So I agree with Mike's ask to get guidance for enforcement to really understand how to treat it.
You're going to say something, Dwayne?
Yeah, I was just going to add, and thanks, Mike, for sharing that description of the status. And we get the question from clients often, why can't Geotab make a change to address this? And I think it's just important to note that there's really no way to build a technical solution to this that's certified without that technical specification guidance from CCMTA and Transport Canada. So yeah, we're supportive of Mike's efforts to ask for the enforcement guidance or an update to the technical spec.
Right. Yeah. Who knew ferry boats could cause so many issues?
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Okay. This one's for you, Mike, and we get this a lot from people who often call in, kind of asking us, wondering. So oftentimes people don't go outside of the 160-kilometer threshold very often, only a few times a year, a few times a month. Do they still need a certified ELD?
Yeah, and this question is relatively easy to answer, and the answer is yes. Where the confusion comes in, I believe, is because of how we differ from the U.S. regulation. The U.S. regulation states that if you don't go outside of the 100 air mile radius any more than 8 times in a 30-day period, they exempt you from having to have an ELD. There's no such exemption in the Canadian regulations. If you go outside that ELD 1 day out of 360 outside, if you go outside the 160-kilometer radius 1 day out of 365, you are going to need an ELD for that 1 day that you're out of the 300 or the 160-kilometer radius. So anytime you're inside it, you don't need the ELD. Anytime you're outside it, you will need the ELD. Really, your options are you really have 3 options. If you only go outside the radius a couple times a year, you have to decide whether you want to put that device in because you need to comply with it, or give that freight to some other outside carrier for the 1 or 2 times a year that it's going to happen. And the third choice is not one I ever recommend. The third one is break the law and hope you don't get caught. But that's, as a previous safety and compliance guy and now somebody who pushes for regulations of the government, that's not one I suggest. Just my personal opinion too. Prior to me taking this role, I was safety and compliance manager at a private fleet. We installed ELDs back in 2013, long before a mandate was in place. Half our fleet went outside the 160-kilometer radius, half of it didn't. We installed them in the mall. Whether they go outside the radius or not, it really helps you track the data. It really helps you increase compliance. So the 160 is a regulation thing. If you're within the 160, it doesn't mean you can't install it. Just doesn't mean you're not required. But for a legal standpoint, if you go outside it, you need it for that day that you go outside. It's the only way you can comply if you're federally regulated.
Right. So the short answer is yes. Yes, you do need an ELD.
And of course, I made that short answer very long.
Yes. That's quite all right. We appreciate your feedback. All right, next question, Dwayne. All right, this is something else that we get a lot. And as the regulation, the timelines are approaching quickly for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, we're hearing that there are still many carriers out there who are delaying their ELD implementations. So Mike, what do you say to those folks out there who are kind of waiting and wondering, I'll put it off until the month before?
Yeah. You're probably already too late. You better get moving, right? If you only operate in these provinces, and don't leave those provinces, so you're not required to have one now. December is only 2.5 months away. January is 3.5 months away. You're already behind the 8 ball. I can tell you from my my own experience when, like I said, when we installed these in the fleet that I was operating at the time. I mean, first of all, you have to go out and research devices. Not all devices are made the same. So you have to go out and research different devices. You have to figure out what the needs of your fleet are and get the appropriate device for your fleet. You then are going to have to place an order to purchase these devices and then wait for them to get shipped to you. That right there could take up to 2 to 3 months, depending on how many you need. You then have to schedule installs of the devices. And before you turn them on, you need to train your drivers, your IT personnel, your administrators, and your dispatchers. They all need to be trained on these. And if you turn them on without anybody being trained, you're asking for an unmitigated disaster. When we did it, we took over 6 months to put it in our fleet at the time. Can you do it quicker than 6 months? Yeah, you can, but you really have to truncate and get things going. So if you're going to require these in the next 2.5 to 3 months, you better get on the phone now and start looking into ordering these, because you're already going to be, it's already going to be pretty problematic for you to have these, everything ready to go by December 1st.
Right. Yeah. And not only that, but you also need to acquire, tablets to run these apps for the drivers themselves. And there's definitely some technology to be learned around it too. All right. Thank you. All right. So last poll. So these are for our attendees, of course. What has been your experience with roadside HOS inspections? So we'll launch this final poll. Give a few more seconds. Okay, great. So we'll share these results. So 21% of you said, great, DOT officers are knowledgeable about the mandate. 40%, which is the majority of people answered, like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get while you're on the road out there. And a small percentage of you, 5%, said terrible. DOT officers are not trained or aware of the mandate. So, that speaks a little bit to what Mike mentioned before with some of the struggles and issues that some of the PMTC members are encountering while on the job. All right, thanks all. And now we'll open it up to attendee Q&A. So we have about 20 minutes. And if you do have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to try to answer them. If you have to leave or we get cut short, just please fill out the survey following the webinar and we'll do our best to answer those questions in the follow-up email along with the webinar recording. All right, so let's take a look at the Q&A. All right, so first up we have from Stephanie. There are all those new exemptions from the Canadian federal government for workers, drivers that help doing storms. All right, so they're sending resources for wildfires and helping out with storms and weather-related incidents. When they're going to help, are they exempted from doing logs? What do you say to that, Mike?
So, I mean, the exemptions, and if you go to the Transport Canada and the provinces for that matter, will issue some exemptions that have expiry dates on them for things like wildfires and storms like we've seen these years. In those requirements, they're pretty specific. So you're exempt from having to comply with the daily and weekly hours of service limits. You're still supposed to keep track of the hours and how much you're driving. whether it can be done in the Geotab app, I'll put that over to Brent, but there still is, it's not just a free for all. Like I say, in the States, when they put out these exemptions, it's a free for all. You can do whatever you want. In a lot of cases from the federal ones. In Canada, there's pretty specific requirements to them as to what you have to do for record keeping requirements, and to make sure that you're still, the carrier and driver are still responsible to make sure they're not operating when they're tired. As soon as they're done responding to the storm, they have to take required time off to make sure they're rested again. So you really need to read the specifics with inside the regulation, but you're exempt from complying with them. You still have to record your hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And then in Geotab specifically, if we're talking about this for wildfires or something similar that exempts you from the availability limits while working in that capacity, as long as you meet those requirements, there is an option to basically set yourself as an exempt status. And it's the way it's implemented in Geotab is, instead of being on like a cycle 1 rule set, let's say, or a cycle 2, you can change that to be exempt. So none of the availability, warnings will necessarily come up because it won't be attributable to it. But then once you leave, working towards that wildfire or whatever the exemption is for, you'd have to make sure to change that specific driver, their profile back to, being governed by cycle 1 or whatever other exemption they might be using at the time.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, this next question, Brian's been answering some of the questions as we go along, so hopefully we've got those ones covered. Again, we will be sharing those with all of you. So this one's from John. Is there any future plan that would expand the 160 kilometer radius, to 180 to 190? Do you see the no, there's no plan.
Hasn't been discussed at all. It's
okay.
not on, not even on the horizon. And I'm going to guess that question's coming up because the US expanded their radius a bit. It's never been discussed in the Canadian regulations.
Okay, so if you go beyond the 160, you need the ELD.
Yeah.
Simple as that. All right. This one's from Frank. Does the ELD mandate apply to logging vehicles drivers? Drivers require HOS and a logbook, but are drivers required to have ELD?
So in the federal regulations, and I'll talk specifically to the federal regs, because provincial regs, each province will issue their own different exemptions if you're only provincially regulated. For the federal regulations, there's no exemptions for log vehicles, so it would apply to them if they're federally regulated. The only exemptions embedded in the federal regulations, just so everybody's clear, is if you're under an hour as a service or motor vehicle transport authority permit, if you operate under the 160 kilometer radius, rental vehicle of less than 30 days, and a pre-model year 2020 vehicle. That's the only exemptions embedded in the regulations. And then there's some that are issued from time to time. One that's kind of been issued across the board is for drive-away operators, which is your piggyback vehicles where they're delivering new vehicles. That has an exemption that's been written outside the regulation. And then there's some specific exemptions in there for certain industries that have applied. But that's all there is. So there's no federal exemption for logging vehicles on ELDs. Province and territory, you'd have to check with the province you're operating in if you're provincially regulated.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. This one's from Laura, and I think she's just looking for a little clarification. So if we have trucks that stay within 160 kilometers, will they have to start using an ELD January 1st?
No, you only have to have an ELD if you're required to keep a log sheet, and a log book sheet is only required outside of 160 kilometers. So within the 160, it's not required legally. Outside of the 160 it is.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. So this one's from Dawn. If you are leaving the province of Nova Scotia, do you have to use an e-log right now?
Yes. You're federally regulated carrier. So, and any federally regulated carrier operating outside the 160 that isn't part of the exemptions that I mentioned has to have an ELD, as they've had to have it since January 1st of 2023.
Yes, that's right. Because New Brunswick, for instance, if you're traveling from Nova Scotia to New Brunswick has had it in place since January 1st.
Well, and not only that, even if New Brunswick didn't have it in place, they're still a federally regulated carrier, right? So even if you don't have it in your provincial regs, if you're federally regulated, it's still enforced in those jurisdictions that don't have it in their provincial regs.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Stephen, what are the requirements for companies to ensure that their subcontractors are in compliance with the mandate?
You get into legal questions, you're best to reach out to the lawyer because it can all depend on what's written into that subcontract.
Yeah, true enough.
And legal issues, is there any legal requirement for you to make sure that they have an ELD in their truck? I can't answer that for sure. But you know, if there's cases where if somebody got into an accident, they can go back onto the shipper who put a product onto a vehicle and hold the shipper liable if they weren't doing their due diligence to make sure the carrier they were using was compliant with the laws. So when you get into legalities, the answer is different depending on what the situation is, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right, true enough. This one's from Anik. What is the law regarding personal conveyance for a driver that was in the USA, came back to Canada? Do drivers need to follow Canadian regulations or follow the USA regulation?
So when they're in Canada, they have to follow the Canadian regs. When they're in the US, they can follow the US regs. So when they're checking you for personal conveyance in the US, they should be checking against the Canadian regs when you're in Canada. They shouldn't be applying the Canadian regs to when you were using it in the States. Where it can become challenging is how it calculates your hours of service. But they shouldn't be able to, they can't apply a Canadian law to something you did in Texas. They can apply it against your 70 and 7 on a later time, but they can't comply towards the conveyance. So short answer, you have to follow the rules and regs for the country that you're in at the time.
Right.
I don't know,
Okay.
Brent, if I seen you nod your head, I don't know if you have anything you want to add or clarify on that, on how the device handles it.
No other feedback? Okay. All right, this one's from Janet, and maybe Brent or Dwayne can respond to this one. My fleet is in a rural area and connection is not the greatest. Does the ELD catch up with the driver if he's unable to log in until after he gets going for the day?
Dwayne, do you want to go or do you want me to?
Yeah, I don't mind taking that one. So definitely the way the Geotab devices and the Geotab Drive app function is they will cache data when you're out of cellular connection, and then fill in the blanks, relative to sending that data to the server and to one another once they're back in connection. There is a restriction in that relative to, you referenced logging in. So the driver does require cellular connection or a connection, even if it's Wi-Fi in their home, to log into the Drive app and associate themselves to the vehicle. So that does require a cellular or internet connection. It could be facilitated through Wi-Fi in their home. But then once that connection is made that they're driving that vehicle, the caching and the synchronization that I just described will happen. How'd I do, Brent?
I think you did great. The only thing that I'll include is there is another optional product offering of a cable that directly connects the telematics device, so what's collecting the data from the vehicle, to the ELD application, so that there's no issues. If you are a carrier that often drives out of cell service, you can have that cable. You'll get everything in real time. Again, like Dwayne mentioned, it won't necessarily let you log in, so you'll still need to figure out a way for your drivers, maybe using Wi-Fi in their home terminal or something to get going. But once they're in, they have access to all their previous data, even if they go out of cell service. And if they want to use this optional cable, then all the data will be up to date at all times.
It's fantastic.
Okay.
Great addition, Brent. Thank you. And we can provide details on that option for anyone who's interested in that relative to Geotab.
Great. Okay, this one possibly for Brent or Dwayne again. So Roger's asking, when a driver forgets to log out at the end of the day and the mechanic then drives the vehicle, how can that time driven by the driver be removed from the original driver?
You want to take that one, Brent?
Sure. So just to make sure I understand, so the driver is assigned to the, regular driver, let's say, is assigned to the vehicle, then they don't unassign themselves and somebody else moves the vehicle, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So that is a tough spot to be in for the original driver for sure. There's not a lot of recourse allowed to them um, within the ELD standard. We do have an additional feature on top of this that, anytime we reach out to regulators on what to do in this specific situation or what fleets should do. Everybody gets back to us both in Canada and the US and just say, you're not allowed to edit it, obviously. So all you can do is annotate it with, the situation that might have happened and explain that at roadside or during an audit or whatever a regulatory body will actually be reviewing that information. The additional feature that Geotab provides for this situation is we do have a way of sort of correcting your availability. It won't change any view for a regulatory body. So if you do get pulled over, we're still sending all of the required data. The driving time is still attributable to the driver, but they can essentially discount that driving time for their availability specific to the explanation that they provide the officer at roadside. So it's a bit of a, it softens the blow a little bit, and that they're still able to, hopefully continue on with their day driving if they weren't actually driving the vehicle, but have correct availability even despite this problem happening. But I do want to emphasize that it does need to be explained to a regulatory body in full in order for that to actually be appropriate.
Okay.
Yeah, and if I can add, Brent, too, because I mean, and where a lot of the issue come in is before they were certified for the Canadian marketplace, you actually could go in and edit that, right? Like a supervisor at a company could go in and remove that driving time, assign it to somebody else, the other driver could accept it, and then that issue went away. It's not allowed in the Canadian regulations, so there's no editing of any automatically recorded driving time at all, as you mentioned. So yeah, you have to explain and hope that they accept your explanation. But one thing I always tell drivers, because this especially is an issue when you first put ELDs in, your drivers will forget to log out of the device in some cases. They might put themselves off duty, but they don't log themselves out of the device. And then the truck's moved and it actually goes on to their driving line. Mm-hmm. And until it becomes second nature, the drivers just sometimes forget to do this. But what I always used to encourage our drivers to do to ensure this doesn't happen is don't put yourself off duty when you're done for the day. Completely log out of the device, log out of it altogether. So if somebody else moves it, it's now unidentified driving time, which can be assigned. It's not placed on you, and now it can't be edited. So encourage your drivers, just like they would a computer, so it gets updates, completely log out of it and shut it off at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Good
Yeah, it
point.
speaks to that importance of training that you referenced earlier, Mike. And
you still will run into it, no matter how good you train. We're people, and we're going to forget, right?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
All right. Next question's from Jason. So this is just to clarification once again on who needs an ELD. So there was talk of an exemption to use paper logs for trucks that only occasionally travel outside the 160 kilometer. Is it confirmed that it must be electronic for all instances?
Yes. Yeah. And so anything outside of the 160 kilometer radius in Canada has to be on an ELD. Period. It's the story. If you're federally regulated.
There you go. Okay. This one's from Don. Alberta not having a mandate if you go outside the 160 kilometer radius, will paper logs still work?
And the answer to that would be depends. If you're a provincially regulated carrier who never leaves the province of Alberta, no ELD mandate, you can use paper logs. If you're a federally regulated carrier, then you need an ELD if you go out of the 160. So it depends if you're provincially regulated or federally.
Okay. Thank you. All right. From Keith. Do we have any guidelines on what will happen during a facility audit? Specifically, do we know what will happen around unassigned driving? Is there an acceptable amount of unassigned driving?
That's going to depend on the auditor. Right. Is there an acceptable amount? No, not really. All driving time has to be accounted for. So it has to be assigned to someone. Is the officer going to give you a little bit of leeway? Possibly, depends how often it shows up. If it's a rare occurrence that hardly ever shows up within your fleet, they may note it and not charge you. If it's happening continuously, then it's going to be an issue. So can't give you a straight answer because it's up to the interpretation of the auditor. But technically within the law, all driving time has to be accounted for. So technically there's no acceptable amount of unassigned driving.
Right. Okay. Very good. This question's from Neil and pointed at you, Mike. I'll have you answer this one. So in terms of DOT officers, in your experience or what you know, how long does it take them to be trained to audit ELD?
Well, it should have been done already. And so
Right.
how long will it take? That I can't answer. When should it have been done? Long before the mandate came into place. So,
right.
And I'm sure in some jurisdictions and with some officers it was, with others it wasn't. So there shouldn't be an officer out on the road who's required to check hours of service that is not trained on how to use an ELD. Because how do they enforce the regs if they don't know how to?
That's right. Yeah. All right. Question from Richard. This one's a longer one. How does the system monitor the hours for drivers that have a primary job through the week, driving a large truck, and then they drive for another company or themselves on weekends? Each truck should have an ELD, but the hours are kept separate. Is this not the same as keeping two logbooks?
Yeah, so the way that has to be handled, and this is written into the hours of service, and it was in there before we had ELDs. So if you have two different jobs, you are required by law to report those hours back to the other company. So if you work for company A and company B, in company A, you could be a truck driver. Company B, you could be working at the local Tim Hortons. I'll use that as an example. Before you go drive truck for company A, the hours that you work for company B have to be reported to that carrier. So if you were keeping a paper log, you'd actually be required to notate this as on duty for another company. And you're actually supposed to provide copies of timesheets from that other company. Or if you had to keep a logbook for them, you have to supply copies of the logbook to that other carrier. So you'd have to exchange the information back and forth. So if you have two different ELDs that aren't connected, what you're actually going to have to do is, what you should be doing is putting the hours into the device. Most ELDs will have the ability for you when you log in to go back to previous days and put on duty hours in there. So your logbook is now accurate. So your ELD tracks it accurately. And you should also keep a paper copy of the logs from the other one with you if you have them. But most ELD devices could print them off. So what I would suggest you do is you print off the logs from the one ELD and carry it with you when you're in the truck with the other ELD and vice versa. You can still enter it in there, which I recommend you do so it tracks it. But I'd also carry the paper evidence with me so you have hard proof that, yes, I am in compliance with the law. But you are required to enter those hours for both.
Okay. Yeah. All right, great. All right, so it's just about 3 o'clock, so we're going to wrap up. Any remaining questions, we're going to do our best to answer them in the follow-up email that will go out to all registrants of the webinar. So I'll let Dwayne take it from here to close it off.
Fantastic. Well, that hour went very quickly, and I want to first thank Julie for all of her work putting together this webinar and getting a good group of folks to join us. Really excited to see the turnout today, and a very special thank you to Mike and Brent for joining and sharing their expertise and knowledge. And the last thank you, of course, is to all of the participants for spending the hour with us and coming with your great questions. So in follow-up, we will send the answers to questions out as well. The survey will follow. We'll be conducting the draw for the Yeti water bottles shortly. So cross your fingers and stay tuned to see if you're a winner. And there will be a recording of this webinar shared with all of you as well. So if you do have any ELD needs in your fleet, and we are here to help, and our toll-free numbers on the screen, and certainly with the survey follow-up, if you would like a specific follow-up on any of our products or services, please let us know in your response to the survey. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.